But now I don't get it.
Well, she's trying to teach you to fire.
All right, we're going to go ahead and start.
Okay.
If the rest of the class shows up, that'll be great. Probably sitting at the church or something. We are recording this, so I'll begin by saying this is the New Covenant School Doctrine. I'm calling it the Doctrine Seminar for summer 2012. My name's Monte, Hancock. And I've got some handouts here, but I'll hand them out a little bit later. So you can take notes if you're a note taker. The handout for tonight is about 6 pages long. What is the schedule for this course? Yeah, when are we done? First week of August, and this is June 12th, so that's like 6 weeks or something. Okay, so we have about 6 or 7 meetings, depends on what you guys want to do and what we decide we want to talk about. Nobody's taking this for any kind of credit, so we don't have to have any sort of evaluation. We can have a freewheeling discussion, and you don't have to worry about ticking off the instructor. I did wear sort of imposing professorial kinds of clothes, you know, just so that I could rule by fear if necessary. But then I realized Joan's going to be here, and she never falls for that stuff. So I'm just going to take my glasses off and give up on that. Because if I start trying to fake stuff, she's going to call my bluff, and then it'll all be over anyway. We'll go ahead and start. The purpose, really, of this class is to provide people with a survey of Orthodox Christian doctrine. When I use the term orthodox, I'm referring to those things which have been regarded by the historic church as elements of the faith which are generally accepted as being valid and proper points of doctrine. For Protestants, that means that they are derived from the Scriptures in some way. For other faith traditions, notably Catholicism, points of doctrine may also be derived through church authority or through tradition. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about Catholic doctrine in here, except to contrast it with Protestant doctrines when that becomes a reasonable thing to do. Every once in a while, some conflicts between Protestant and Roman Catholic Orthodox doctrine pop up in popular culture today, and you see them, especially in light of Vatican II and the more recent councils. And we'll say something about those things just so that people kind of understand where everybody's coming from. But I think everyone in here, though I know some of you have a Catholic background, are Protestant Christians. Not all of us know what we're protesting, but when we talk about the Council of Trent in the 1550s, then you'll suddenly realize what it is you're protesting, okay? Yeah. Right now, we're just kind of all protesting something, but we don't know. So you're holding these blank signs. You know, we're again it. Well, anyway, what I have done in the past in teaching this course is, and what most people do, is they break areas of doctrine down into separate topical categories, and then we'll address those in turn, usually starting with the more fundamental components of belief. Most people, therefore, would start by discussing the doctrine of God and move from there to discussing the doctrine of man. And then from there are a whole bunch of different directions you can go. You can talk about, depending on what you're interested in, you can talk about then the doctrine of the church. The doctrine of the Scriptures has got to be in there somewhere close to the beginning of the list, because as Protestants, we're going to want to derive our doctrine from the Scriptures in some way, and so we've got to understand why we ought to believe the Bible is true as opposed to believing something else is true. There's plenty of things out there you can believe. Why pick this one? I think we're going to be talking about things in order like that, but I'm not going to start by talking about the doctrine of God. I want to pull things farther back than that, precisely because we have some young folks in here who are going to encounter challenges that old geezeroids such as myself didn't really have to cope with in quite the same way. When I went off to college, people were not asking me the same kinds of questions that you're going to face. I mean, the questions were really the same, but these days, you face additional challenges you didn't face. So what I want to do is I want to begin tonight by talking about truth and knowledge and faith and belief and these more fundamental things. And then next week we're going to begin talking about the doctrine of God. And I will from time to time refer back to some of the things we discussed tonight. I want to talk tonight about things like, the question Pilate asked, what is truth? How can we know truth? How do we know that what we know is true? I want to talk about some of those issues in the way that the church has addressed those questions. And those are the kinds of things that people are going to ask you when you go off to college and you're sitting around the dorm room talking about, faith things or just talking about life in general, and somebody will say something, oh, well, I don't think blah, 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 blah. And you'll say, well, I do think. And why do you think that? Well, because my faith says that, the Bible says that, my mom told me that, my pastor said that. And you're immediately going to find yourself subject to a long list of questions about why do you believe that's true? How can you defend that? What makes that better than what I believe? And so you really need to be prepared to at least understand the questions you're being asked. Now, I don't want to suggest to you that people are necessarily malevolent in asking questions like this. They don't know what they're doing. I mean, they're just dumb kids like you are, right? But they hear these questions that sound clever, and they want to sound clever, and so they'll ask you things that they think are hard questions, without even the ability to assess a cogent answer. But that's just what college is like. Everybody there wants to show everybody else how smart they are and cool and all that kind of stuff, and so they'll ask you hard questions. And most of the time, they don't really care what the answer is. They're not interested in the answer. They just want to, it's all about the interaction and the banter and the chest thumping and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's what it's about, okay? But the reason that we need to take this seriously is that if you're a believer, if you're a Christian, and you go off to college and you get into all this stuff, you know what? You do take that stuff seriously. And if everybody around you is doing this other crazy stuff and they're jerking you around, giving you a hard time, that doesn't hurt them at all. It doesn't bother them. It's just part of the deal. They think it's funny. You won't think it's funny. It can be hurtful. And if you at least know the substance of these questions and the substance of appropriate answers, you won't be hurt. That's really what my goal is. For you to know that there are reasonable answers to questions that sound like they're deep, mind-bending questions. Right? So I want to address some of these. How do you know what you know? How do you know it's true? So I want to talk about truth. Now, there's one thing that you'll find in the Scriptures, is a verse that says, truth lies dead in the street. Ever heard that verse? I'll get you a reference to it. But it's talking about the situation we see today, where people say that what's true is false and what's false is true. And it's almost as though truth, if you were to imagine truth as a person, they've been slain by the popular worldview, and they're just out in the street, and everybody's having a party, driving by, walking by, and there's this carcass laying there, and nobody even notices it. And if you listen to the radio, it's unbelievable that people will say things that are patently false, that they know are false, and that everybody in the audience knows is false, and it just passes by. Nobody says anything. It amazes me. Certainly in the realm of politics, we see stuff like this all the time. But you see things like this in lots of other places, too. Ever hear a car commercial? But there's lots of places where people just say things that are not true or designed to be misleading, and we just expect it. We let it pass. We're not surprised at all. Quite frankly, I think because truth lies dead in the street. It's not alive anymore. We've killed it, and we've replaced it with something else. I'm just going to go ahead and pass my notes out. And I want to work through this handout tonight. I'll use this as a general kind of guide. Put that right there. Oh, you're so generous. Put that right there. I'm just going to start on the front page. I typically organize my presentation materials and my notes in terms of lists of ideas, and just points that we can talk about. And I find that to be very useful because it sort of organizes my thoughts into categories, and I can think about them in chunks, right? And it helps me understand when I'm changing from one chunk to another chunk. And so I'd like to begin. I'll talk about what philosophy is a little bit. So we're kind of talking about philosophy tonight. You know, when people talk about truth and related issues, how do we know things? They're really talking about philosophical issues. And so when you go off to college and people want to talk about philosophy, they'll ask you questions about God and man and justice and beauty and all that kind of stuff. And they're talking about truth, and those are philosophical questions. Of course, for us as believers, we think that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the truth. In Him, all of the truth of God is present as an active person in the world, a real live person. And he is the embodiment of everything that is true. In Him are found all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. He Himself is the truth. And there isn't any other truth or any truth that stands in opposition to the truth that He brings us. And so when you start talking about truth and belief and knowledge, you invariably kind of go back and forth between the realm of philosophy and theoretics and what did Plato say about this, and he was an idealist, but Descartes was a rationalist, and he was a dualist, and he said this, blah, 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 blah. How many, teeth does a horse have, and that kind of stuff. But I want to start by talking about sort of the philosophical view of truth, and that will bring us into what the early theologians said about what is true and how we can know what is true, and Thomas Aquinas and his 5 ways and all that. So let me just begin. I put a definition on here. Philosophy, the study of truth and knowledge, that's just what I called it for lack of a better term, may be regarded as mankind's attempt to answer the great questions. We all have questions. We're born asking questions. And some questions are sort of trivial, like I wonder if they really gave me the full 1.25 liters of soda that I paid for here. And I could ponder that, but you know what? If they did or if they didn't, and if I figure it out and if I don't, who cares? So what? That's kind of a trivial truth. It's a truth that doesn't make a difference in the world. But there are some truths that make it... Take that back. Never use the word truth in the plural. That's anathema. There are some aspects of truth there are some aspects of truth that are very significant, and they will have a direct impact, not only on what happens to you in the world, but what happens to you in eternity. I claim that there are some things that are truly true. They're really true, and they're true with a capital T. A lot of people don't think that's the case. Okay, so when I talk about the great questions, I'm talking about those questions that, when answered, are fundamental chunks of your worldview, and they'll affect the kind of life that you live. Questions that are not so great, they'll affect whether you're satisfied with your soda or not. Right? That's about the difference there. Okay, a person's worldview, and this is another definition, is their collection of answers to these great questions. That's the definition I'm giving. So if you were to make a list of what you think are the fundamental questions about the world, about God, about knowledge, beauty, ethics, morals, politics, man, if you were to reduce each one of those areas of thought to a single question that, when answered, established your fundamental view of that area of thought, that would be a great question, right? And so what I've done in putting all this stuff together is for each of a collection of about 10 or 12 areas, I have reduced that whole aspect of philosophy to a single question, which, when answered, sort of sets you on a path to a specific collection of responses to that question. And I want to talk about those today. Now, this course is not about convincing you of anything. I'm not practicing evangelism up here. What I want to do is I want to present the various answers that have been given to these questions and the various doctrines that have been proposed to understand God's action in the world, and then you're responsible to select among those. To the extent possible, when it makes sense, I will highlight some of the non-orthodox answers that have been given to questions. Right? For example, in the Gospel of Thomas, it says that women can't be saved. Did you know that? You can't be saved if you're a woman, according to the Gospel of Thomas, which is not in the canon. Okay, so breathe easy here. But as it says in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus had a ready solution for that. He said, by golly, when the other apostles pointed out that Mary was a woman, and that was a problem because women are not destined for glory. So Jesus said, "Yeah, you're right, guys. Well, tell you what, I'll help her to become a woman," and that was his answer. Okay, now
help her become a man.
I'm sorry, help her become a man. I'm sorry, I got it backwards. Yeah, I'll help her become a man, and then everything will be copacetic, and we'll all be okay. Okay, well, the Gospel of Thomas is nonsense, but there are unorthodox doctrines that are kind of blowing around out there. And every once in a while, when we get close to one of those, I'll bring them up just so that we'll know that they're there. All right? Because oftentimes, if you painted a picture, try and think of this. Suppose you tried to paint a picture of things, but your way of delineating things was to leave out all the boundaries. There can be no boundaries in any of your pictures. All right, so you paint an eye, and you think, okay, here's a pupil. I don't want any boundaries here, so I better make it a little bigger. And it's still got if I put anything around it, that's going to make a boundary, so I just better make it bigger. In the end, you're going to have a picture of a huge hole, right? Oftentimes, the truth is best understood by contrasting it with things that it's right up next to, but doesn't go into. And so when I say, here is a doctrine that has been important historically in this area, and you say, oh, so what? Well, the reason it's there is because this other view was prevalent at the same time, and people were getting into this, and that's why it's there. All right? So as we talk about some of those things, when I put those little signposts up, they're there to tell you where things that are true stop and things that are untrue start. So that can be helpful, and plus some of them are so odd that they may be more memorable than the truth itself. Okay, anyway, the gospel is gender neutral there. It's egalitarian in its application, so you don't need to worry. Unless you're a Mormon, then you're in serious trouble. Okay, we'll get into that some other day. And of course, the reason we study philosophy, the reason we study theology, and the reason we study all these sort of theoretical kinds of things is so that we can formulate a worldview that allows us to live a good life. And when I say good, I don't mean, fun. I had a Mustang and, all that kind of stuff. I mean a life of quality. All right? Good in the philosophical sense. I mean, really, a life of quality. Whatever that means to you, and you're going to have to decide that too. But if we don't think about these things, if we don't ask questions about what's true and how can we know what's true, and then here's what will happen if you don't ask any of those kinds of fundamental questions. What happens is there are some things that you think about just because you're sort of confronted with them. You see a movie and there's some guy that's doing something and you think, wow, that's probably not right. And you kind of think on it a little bit and you build a little piece of truth there, and that becomes part of the way you view things, right? Or your mom says this, or your dad says this, or you see something happen at school, or you're reading a book, or whatever it is, and you encounter little bits of truth and you sort of incorporate those into your worldview. And it's just like we learn everything else, Whatever has been working in my life, I've just sort of assumed that's true because it works. It's the utilitarian theory of truth. If it works, it's true. If it doesn't work, it's not true. Okay. Well, your experience is going to be limited because you're a limited thing. You are a creature. Creature, the technical term, it's literally a created thing. You are a thing that is created, and you are finite and bounded. Your time here is finite. Your experience is finite. The scope of your senses is finite. The scope of your mind is finite. And that means that you don't have universal experience. There are going to be some things you never happen to experience. And guess what? If your entire mechanism for understanding what is true is based on these little, serendipitous occurrences that allow you to weave a little piece of truth into your mind, there's all these holes up there. I haven't experienced that, and so there's a big hole there. Now, that's fine until you're put on the spot. What about the pygmies in Africa? You just told me that God loves everybody, and now he's gonna banish to hell this pygmy who never had a chance to make a choice? And it's like, and what's happening there is, well, you never really thought about that, firstly. But also, since you haven't thought about these things in their generality, what is the basis for God's plan of salvation? How is it that people come to be lost or saved? And I mean really in the general sense. I don't want to think about how did I become lost or saved, or how did my mom become lost or saved. That's an example. I don't want an example. I need a principle. You understand the difference between a principle and an example? Right? You get a whole bunch of examples and you can infer a principle from that. You have one principle, you can generate an infinite number of examples. It's much better to have the principle, right? But if you don't have the principle and all you have is a few examples with some holes, what you're going to do is on the spot, you are going to create a default answer that fits with whatever's foremost in your mind right now. And that's what you're going to do. It's going to be this sort of,
really letting your emotions decide.
And that's true. It probably depends on what you had for lunch, Well, it says, they'll be judged based on what the light they had, and people that, didn't know anything will have few stripes and all that. Well, it's following up on that. Somebody's going to take that and say, well, you went to church for all these years, and I didn't have that, so God can't judge me. You're way ahead of me. How can God judge me the same way he judges you? All right, and pretty soon you're in trouble. Because what's happened is they've taken your half-baked response, which was sort of blurted out on the spur of the moment, and they have said, here's what this guy's systematic theology is. And I can knock the props out from under this with a couple of well-placed questions. And the fact is they can, because your principle isn't based on anything. It's just something you blurted out. So one of the reasons we want to talk about this stuff and things that just sound like weird theoretical pie-in-the-sky type questions is not so that when theoretical pie-in-the-sky type things happen, we're going to have thought about them. It's so that we can develop the principles now, because they will see you through whatever you do happen to encounter. All right? Get the principles down now. Have your building put together now. Don't try and go to the 20th floor if the first 10 floors are not there. Right? It just sort of makes sense. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. And so I've got to tell you what the great questions are. And if you've got the handout, you can see my short list here. And we'll just kind of go down the short list. These are the various topics. Now, this is a world view. These are not really the great questions. These are the great questions. And then we have our mnemonic questions. I'm sorry, these are great. Yeah, these are great. Well, I have another list that's sort of how do you decide how to live well? And that has other things like, where am I going to go to church? Who am I going to marry? How much education do I want? That kind of stuff. Not some great questions, which derive from these. So here, the first question, the question about ultimate reality. What is reality? What's real? And that's been answered in various ways. I'm referring to that as the metaphysical question. What is really real in the universe? Do the phenomena of sense experience have an actual existence, or are these merely sensations that I have? Am I interacting with anything more than just my sensory apparatus? I feel stuff here, but that's really just a series of electrical impulses going to my brain, which is causing certain kinds of electrochemical transfers within my neurons across synapses, and I have these experiences, but that's not the real thing. That's little synapses firing up here. And I get that synapse firing when I do this, and I get that synapse firing when I drink some soda, and, well, what's real? Pretty soon you get confused when you start thinking about that stuff. Okay, and what about ideas? What about when I add 1 plus 1 and get 2? Is 1 real in the same way that Coke Zero is real? Does it have an independent reality apart from people thinking about the idea of 1? And that sounds like a stupid question, but there are actually areas in which that gets kind of vague. When does something that you think is theoretical become something that might actually have an independent existence in some physical form? For example, why do you love your husband? Is it because there is this idea of love? Right? Is it the Platonic concept of this soul bonding? It's not that, right? It's a whole bunch of other stuff, and a person who's a hardcore materialist would say, it's just electrons bouncing against each other in your cerebrum, ma'am. Just like when I drink this soda, it's just other electrons bouncing against each other. And when you get to that point, when you get to that kind of reductionist mentality, that's where things that you thought were just ideas have now been assigned some kind of corporeality, some kind of physicality. And if God is love, then isn't he just electrons bouncing against each other too? If I say I know that God has chosen me because I've heard his voice, electrons. And I can explain it away, right? You really need to think about this stuff because that's what you're going to encounter. What would you say to somebody that said that? Yeah. Leave me alone is probably a good answer. Well, and there's more to that movie than just cool entertainment. That actually represents the way a lot of people think about the world, that what we see really is mere illusion, and that something else is happening behind the screen. You know, that little guy with a white beard back there working those knobs and stuff like that, he's really there. And
that's how vacuums work too, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Turn a vacuum cleaner on, there's little pixies in there that, whirl around real fast, suck that stuff up. But believe it or not, these are things that you should have thought about before somebody asks that question. So the question of ultimate reality, what is real? That's part of this whole mix. And I'm not going to provide any answers to those. I just want you to know that these questions are looming out there because they'd be a whole different course. Secondly, knowledge. Now this is really important. What's called the epistemological problem. That's the question, how do you know? What is the basis of your knowledge? What is knowledge? Is it something that is real? To what does knowledge refer? If I say I know that there's some soda over there on the table, okay, how do I know that? Well, it's because I have a memory of having touched the soda, and I can look at it and see it. But those are not real. Those are merely sensations or ideas that I have up here, and they're not really the real ontological soda. So how do you know what you know? And that's a question you'll get a lot when you talk to just about anybody these days. There are a lot of people out there that are looking for something that they can believe, but they want to know why it's true. And that's the epistemological question. How do you know what you know? And having read it in a book that was written a long, long time ago is not real compelling to a lot of young people these days, because they know about other books that were written a long, long time ago, and that just doesn't ring their bell. And so, and quite frankly, there is more to the answer than that. All right. The teleological question, very important, became a real issue in the 20th century. Wasn't really so much an issue before, and that is, do things happen in the world for a reason or not? Or is this a world of happenstance, random processes, and meaningless physical laws that exist to no end and serve no purpose? They just are. Such a world is called a dysteleological world. It's devoid of meaning and purpose. And you may have heard of something called existentialism. You ever heard of that? It was a philosophy first proposed really as a school of thought by a guy named Sartre, S-A-R-T-R-E, French guy, and a real scoundrel, by the way. What's that?
French.
Well, yeah, figures. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of his life, his mistress was procuring college girls for him. I mean, that's the kind of guy he was, Just very odd. But he formulated a point of view that said, down the centuries, we have focused on the attributes of things. And we've said things are big, things are small, things are good, things are bad. And the medieval philosophers, the scholastics, referred to as the essentials. When you talked about the essence of something, you were talking about its qualities or its characteristics, its flavorfulness, its fizziness, right? And the sort of cool rebound you get when you squeeze the bottle a little bit. There's life in that. But those are aspects of the essence of that thing, and we distinguish between things in terms of their essence. And the scholastic philosophers used to argue about whether the accidents, that is, the properties or qualities, had a separate existence apart from the thing. For example, this soda is tasty, but is tastiness a thing in itself which has an existence separate from things that are tasty? Is there a quality of tastiness that is associated with the thing, and is it separate? And if I take the thing away, does the tastiness remain? They argued about that stuff, right? People got burned at the stake for stuff like that. But Sartre said, that's all crazy. We shouldn't be talking about that stuff at all. Why? Because those things are all based on your experiences of the world, and those are no more reliable than anybody else's, and we all disagree. Therefore, what we should focus on is not the fact that things have this essence or that essence, but that they exist. And this philosophy he called existentialism, because it focused not on trying to understand things, but just to recognize their existence. Because you couldn't understand things. To worry about whether there was anything more than the thing itself was to be deceived. Things don't mean anything. There is no separate substance called meaning or significance or purpose. There is no value in anything because there is no evaluator. There are just things. And you need to have the courage to recognize that things exist and that that's all there is. Does that make you feel warm and fuzzy? Now, he had this interesting experience, and I must confess I have had this same experience which was part of inspiring this in him. He was sitting in a park one day on a bench, and he looks out across the field, and he sees this tree. And this tree has a gnarled trunk and twisted branches. It's obviously an aged and decrepit tree. And he looks at it, and he realized in a flash of insight that it was absurd.
What's absurd about it?
It's absurd, meaning that it is devoid of any meaning whatsoever. It just is. Well, yeah. He eventually canned the whole existentialism thing after it had served its financial purpose in his life and became a communist. So what are you going to do? But anyway, now, when you apply that point of view to persons, see, when I'm talking about trees in the park, that's one thing. When I apply that point of view to a person, what am I now doing? Humanity? Image of God?
Saying they're irrelevant.
What is that? Those things aren't real. You have no more meaning than that absurd tree. You just are. There's sort of a mock poem. It's a rewriting of Desiderata, and it starts out, "You are a fluke of the universe. You have no right to be here." Real positive and encouraging. But
60 million abortions.
yeah. But the fact of the matter is, think about the abortion holocaust that we have. Think about the Nazi Holocaust. All that was happening there was a bunch of meaningless things were being removed. They were no more meaningful than the things that removed them.
Not true.
And their removal had no significance. So for Sartre, what you had to do, and this goes all the way back to Kant. Kant had a little bit of the same sort of idea, but he wasn't a total pagan. But Sartre said that the only rational act in the face of an irrational world is to have the courage to make choices anyway, recognizing that they don't matter and make no difference whatsoever. You guys are laughing.
I know.
A couple of years from now, you'll be sitting in college, and your professor will be standing up there telling you all this, and people will be writing this stuff down like crazy. They'll think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. One thing that it does do is it frees me from any responsibility for the consequences of my actions.
So what's the point of brain?
There is no point. This kind of worldview, the one that strips value from everything, leaves me in a position where I make all the decisions. I'm not accountable to anyone or anything because they don't matter.
None of the consequences are your fault because of those consequences.
That's right. And I get to choose them, and that's an act of courage. Right? If I smack you in the head because I don't like the way your nostrils look,
I am courageous.
I'm courageous. It wouldn't make any difference for me to not do it, and it wouldn't make any difference for me to do it, so I'm going to do what I want.
It would be great.
But that kind of thinking leads to the... Well, yeah, what it does, it leads to the death of rationality. There is no such thing as rational thought or rational action when nothing has any significance or meaning. I can't even say that the principles of reason are valid because they have no separate existence either. They're just things that people have cooked up in the past that they thought provided a good mechanism for making decisions, and I've decided not to go with those. I'm going to go some other way. And you know what? Just as good as your choice All right, it's like the old Billy Joel song. Go ahead, live your life, leave me alone.
Yeah, we
I like
started
that
it, right?
Right? I mean, we've all heard that song, right?
Actually, no.
Okay, well,
I will soon.
you will soon. That's right.
I've heard that song in its
Yes. Okay, I've spent too much time talking about that. But that is an important part of our study, because one of the things that will distinguish you from your peers in college, if you are an authentic Christian, is the fact that you will believe in a teleological universe. A universe which has a mind behind it, which has a purpose and a plan behind it, and therefore meaning behind it. Further, you, as a creation of this purposer, will yourself have meaning and a place in the purpose. It makes you significant. It means that what you do matters. It is absolutely the opposite of the existential approach. Absolutely the opposite of it. Because you don't discard meaning as an impediment to courageous action. You embrace not just the obligation to make choices, but to make choices which are in an absolute sense right. Does that make sense? Wow. Okay, let's continue on. Beauty. Is beauty in the eye of the beholder?
Yes.
What about blindness?
No.
Okay, well, we've sort of covered the realm of possible answers to that one.
Well,
But
maybe it's in the eye of the Creator.
well, and that's where I would go. All right, the theological question, which we'll deal with after our break. That's where we're going to spend the last half of class, talking about the theological question, the doctrine of God, and how God is related to truth. Value, the axiological question. Are some things better than other things? What is the nature of assessing value in the world? That's a question that we all have to answer all the time. Little kids are really good at it. You know, you take them out there to that ice cream truck in the road. It's like, you know, we need to get the UN over here to help me figure out whether to choose the green one or the orange one. So they're evaluating all this stuff and kind of, you know, ticking off. And we get really good at evaluating things like that. But it's easy to come to the place where you decide that assessment of value is completely arbitrary, and therefore nothing is really more valuable in itself than anything else. In other words, there is no inherent or intrinsic value in anything. Some people think this is good. That's fine for them. Some people think this is good. That's fine for them. Is there in any sense objective value? Well, we won't talk about that now, but that's a question to think about, because the implications of that are, when I have to make a choice in my life, I'm assessing the potential value of the choices I'm going to make and the outcomes of those choices, and I must evaluate them. And if I believe that value is just a random so what, I'm going to end up not making very good choices. Bottom line. Because it doesn't matter. You know, if it doesn't work out, I'll do something else. Go live on mom's couch. The political question. That's something that we're facing this year. How should government be run, organized, and everything else? I'm not going to say anything about that because I don't care. The ethical question. How do we live our lives? How do we decide what's right? How do we decide what's good? Is anything right? I mean, if you tell somebody, don't do that, that's wrong, they're just as likely to slap you as, you know, do anything else. So you'd like to have some mechanism for first knowing whether things are good or right, whether things are bad or wrong. One of the reasons we have such a problem, I think, with the arts is that we've given the wrong answer to the beauty question, and we've given the wrong thing to the good and right question. If you don't think that anything is really beautiful, then what you end up with is the kind of art that we started getting in the 20th century, because beauty had no place in art since 1910, right? It's been banished from art, because art is not about beauty. Art is about expressions pour moi, right? And you're going to pay for it, right? Exactly right. Give me another grant, and I'll hang pink sheets of lamina from, the Empire State Building.
I slapped some paint on a canvas. Bye.
Oh, yeah. My monkey did this last night. I mean, we get into that kind of thing because we have lost our way with respect to the fact that there really are things that are beautiful. There really are things that are good. And there are things that are ugly, and there are things that are bad. Well, we don't believe that anymore. And it gets us into all kinds of trouble. Okay. Let's wrap up the first portion of this in the next couple of minutes and take a break. I want to talk about the general divisions of philosophy. I've already said something about a couple of them. You've seen them in the questions that I mentioned already. This is sort of an expansion of those. First, let's look at the section on epistemology. Remember, that's how do we know things? How can we know things? What can we know? One of the problems that you'll get into when you talk to people is they will confuse the question of whether you can know the answer to something with whether that thing has an answer. That is, you'll say, well, there is an objective truth. And they'll say, you can't know what's right and what's wrong. Do you see what's happened there? They think that because there's an argument about what the truth is, the truth actually doesn't exist. Right? I mean, that's where they're going with that. And they don't realize that they're that stupid. All right? All right. The question of whether we can know what is true or not, I'll grant you, is a difficult question. And we'll address that after I make my point, which is some things are true and some things are not. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay. Now, a lot of people will deny that that's even the case. But you got to get them there first. Okay. So, we talk about epistemology. Here are some of the answers that have been given to the epistemological question. And I arranged them in their historical order. So, the very earliest sort of scholarly attempts in the West, in the Western world, I'm only talking about Western stuff, European, American kinds of stuff. Scholasticism. Scholasticism was the sort of the science of thought in the early Middle Ages all the way up to almost the 20th century, I'd say. And it was a worldview, an approach to knowledge and understanding what is true that was heavily funded by the Catholic Church. Lots of the early, the middle church scholars, St. Thomas Aquinas probably being the most notable, but others, Hildebrand and Erasmus and other folks. Erasmus wasn't a scholastic, but in that same time, what they were trying to do, the point of view behind scholasticism is that it has to do with your epistemology, the source of knowledge. How do we know what things are true? Some things we know are true by virtue of natural law or natural philosophy. Talk about natural philosophy. What you're talking about are the things that everyone can know by virtue of our common experience. Right? I know that soda is tasty. And you can know that too because you can have some soda and discover that it's tasty. Now we may disagree on how tasty it is, right? And whether this is tastier than that, but we can all experience the tastiness of soda. And the point is, I don't have to have a revelation from God to know that Coke Zero is tasty. All right?
I would.
Okay. Maybe Sandy bought this. I didn't buy it. Oh yeah! Oh yeah!
That's another question.
You guys are too funny here.
Accountable.
But aspects of knowledge that can only be known by revelation, those don't fall under the category of natural philosophy. That is revealed knowledge, and according to the scholastics, revealed knowledge was received and communicated to the faithful by the church, and that was done through the church leadership, the ecclesiastical hierarchy, most notably the Vicar of Christ, the Pope, who had the authority after the Fourth Lateran Council to speak ex cathedra, that is with infallible authority when he decided to do so. But could also be ascertained by the church through scholastic philosophy. That is, you would think with an enlightened mind in the light of Scripture and church doctrine and dogma and the councils and the ecclesiastical hierarchy, and you would think in a way that was consistent with all these things, and you would discern. Now this is the church discerning. You're a peon. You can't discern anything. You listen to me, I'll tell you what's true. But you would discern what is true. This is what the philosopher, St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, was a first-rate philosopher, and he was a systematizing philosopher, and he built a worldview which was the foundation for scholasticism. But this was, the knowledge which was generated by enlightened consideration of the truth in light of the action of God in the world, in a way that was consistent with church doctrine. And that's how you figured out what was true, is you thought about it. You didn't go out and do experiments. Catholic Church was not big into funding laboratories to go out and do measurements. Why? Why?
Because you can't control the result.
Well, there may have been political motivation, but the bottom line is nobody was doing that.
Well, the Greeks did the same thing. They stood around and talked.
Yeah, exactly. You want to know how many teeth are in a horse's mouth? You don't look in a horse.
Right.
Because that horse, according to Plato, is just an imperfect copy of the true ideal horse. I mean, you laugh, but that was the worldview. How did you learn and discover what was true? This way. You said, how many teeth should a horse have? Right? The same way that you would say, here's a right triangle. It has a leg that's 2, a leg that's 3. How long should the hypotenuse be? Okay? You discover knowledge that way, don't you? Did you have to make a triangle to do that? If you did, you'd get the wrong answer, because that triangle is just an imperfect copy of the triangle you're actually thinking about. The problem was they put no boundaries around that point of view. Everything that you see and experience in the physical world is an imperfect copy of the ideal. And therefore, the way you learned things was you thought about them until you figured it out. And so the scholastics worried about things like, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? I mean, we use that as a joke. That's not a joke. It ought to be possible to think about that and determine the answer by enlightened reason. Right? Obviously, you cannot do an experiment. I don't know. but I've read accounts of it where some people said 3, and they give this long scriptural argument, where it was 3, and other people would say it was 5, and they give all these Bible verses about where it had. Okay. But that is one way of answering the epistemological question. How do I know something's true? Because the priest told me it was true. Right? The priest told me it was true. I asked him. Oh, okay, then it is true. And that settled the question for a lot of people. They didn't have to worry about why something was true. You go ask the priest. If he didn't know, he'd ask the bishop. If he didn't know, work its way on up. Somebody in the magisterium would eventually decide whether it was true or not, and then it would filter its way on back down, and you'd be burned at the stake for asking a question like that. Okay.
I would. This is why you ask it, right?
Yeah, you'd be in trouble.
Okay. Now, we've shifted away from that for a number of reasons. I mean, that there have been some things that have happened in history that have sort of changed the way people in general regard the world. The Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, I'm not going to talk about church splits and all that stuff. There's an Eastern Church and a Western Church, and then there's actually the Orthodox Church, which is a different brand there, and then there's the Ebionites, and they're down in Africa, and it's all different. But the Roman Catholic Church was the biggest block, certainly had purview of what was happening in Europe. And maybe when we talk about the church, I'll explain how those things all came about and why the Roman Church is the one that had the most influence over European stuff, and the Eastern Church didn't have much influence there. But they reached a pinnacle of political power in the 1100s. You get to the 13th century, and the Roman Church was beginning to lose its ability to have complete, unchallenged authority in secular affairs. There was a time when, say, under Innocent III, for example, where the Pope could say, "You're not king anymore, you are," and it stuck. I mean, there was a time when they could do that. That time ended by the time the 13th century rolled around, and they started to kind of move back to where now they've got Vatican City and the surrounding area, and that's the only venue within which they can make authoritative statements in the secular realm, because there is no secular realm. It's all an ecclesiastical realm. So if that shrinks, now the power of your scholastic worldview shrinks with it, and something else is going to come in and replace it. And the thing that really challenged a lot of these ecclesiastical approaches to knowledge had to do with things like the Renaissance, the rebirth of knowledge. It's kind of a misnomer, sort of the rediscovery of all the things that stupid Europeans destroyed, but that were preserved mostly by the Muslims. We need to thank those guys for that, folks. But and then of course, when you get to the middle of the 15th century, two very important things happened that caused really a complete transformation in the way people viewed the world. One of them in 1454 was the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg. And what this made possible was, it made it possible for me as one person to actually present my ideas to hundreds or thousands of people. See, before that wasn't possible. If I was just one guy, living out in my hut somewhere, farming mud or whatever it was I did, I probably wouldn't move more than 10 miles from the place I was born my whole life. And I might talk to 30 or 40 different people in my whole life. And that was my sphere of influence. And if I had a great idea, it couldn't go anywhere. There was no medium by which the ideas of an individual could get any traction beyond just a little teeny tiny dot on a map somewhere.
Unless that individual was like the Pope or something.
Yeah, but those guys had other things they were worried about. They weren't great system builders or mathematicians or engineers.
Nowadays, we have YouTube.
Exactly right. See, I could go home tonight and I could put an idea up in front of 20 million people as one person, and it would be easy. That is an astonishing thing. That is a Tower of Babel thing. Think about that. That changes the world. Anyway, don't want to talk about that too much, but when Gutenberg made his printing press, it was really sort of like the internet, in 1450. Now I could actually reach out and touch hundreds or thousands of people with my ideas without traveling myself. That was an amazing thing. Now it was more expensive than most people could do, but there was one guy that was able to make tremendous use of that just 50 or 60 years later. His name was Martin Luther. In 1517, 63 years later, the printing press was well established. There were lots of presses in lots of places. If you wanted to get some controversial ideas out, you could do it as long as you could insulate yourself from the powers that be. And Luther was in a position to do that because he had a patron that was willing to protect him. Unlike his predecessor, Jan Hus, who was saying a lot of the same things 100 years earlier and ended up getting burned at the stake. So that was one change. The other change was in 1450, the founding of the University of Paris and the foundation of other universities in great European cities created centers of learning that made it possible to standardize knowledge across the continent. Before that happened, different thinkers were at different levels. They didn't have access to your ideas or your ideas. In order to really get any kind of chain reaction of invention and innovation going, you have to have ideas from different people mixing together so that everybody can get those ideas and mix them together and add their... That's where you get the multiplying factor of the human mind, right? Because if I get your idea, I may never have had that idea, or it may save me 2 years, of mud farming to get that idea. And since I'm only going to live for 25 years anyway, that's a good thing, right? So those two things happening really changed the way people thought about knowledge. And then, of course, about the same time, end of the 1500s, you have guys like René Descartes, Galileo, the end of the 1500s, who essentially single-handedly made empirical science an issue. He used to carry a rock around in his pocket. And he would talk to the scholastics or the other folks, who'd say, well, the planets move in fixed spheres. We can't see them, I guess, because they're transparent, but they move in these fixed spheres. And how do you know that? That question works both ways. How do you know that? That's the teaching of the church. That is the teaching of the church. Right? There's even a hymn that talks about the music of the spheres. Of course, that's probably a Charles Wesley tune. But anyway. And what he would do is he'd reach into his pocket and he'd pull a rock out and he'd say, I'm going to drop this rock for you and I want you to tell me why it falls. Don't tell me the church told you that that's what rocks do. I know rocks fall because when I do this and I open my hand, I see them fall. I do an experiment. Right? He didn't say it that way, but that was the idea. He said, by interacting with the creation, we learn how it works. That was not at all the scholastic approach. The scholastic approach was to figure out how the creation ought to work by thinking God's thoughts the way he would have thought them if we'd been there. Well, that's, you get what you get. And that didn't go well for him anyway. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break. When we come back, what we're going to do is we're going to shift gears from all this stuff. And we're going to start talking specifically about God and what it might be possible for us to know about God and how we can know those things and what the basis of our knowledge is. And I'm hoping that will be more interactive because I've just been up here pronouncing, But we'll talk about those things. And I'm interested in your feedback and what you think about those things in light of the fact that we've talked a little bit about knowledge, and we understand that not everybody agrees about what knowledge is and whether you can have it or not, and how you know that it's really knowledge. Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break.
That thing about the